Pablo as a young, was it a 19-year-old Pablo?
I guess,
Yeah.
1974.
Seems to be a long way back, but um, as a 19-year-old, Pablo won a World Press Photo Award for his work on morphine addicts.
Yeah, these were morphine.
Yeah.
Well, in the mid-70s, the hippie movement sort of started to decline, and the junkie movement started to rise. So many Europeans, mainly, not Americans so much, came looking for harder drugs. And India was, or still is, one of the places where opium is grown legally. And we have a government pharmaceutical factory, or now a few, and they produce all the opiate derivatives, including morphine. And in the 70s, security was kind of lax, and it was available on the street quite easily.
Yeah. So that was work that Pablo had done, and it won him, as a 19-year-old, one of the most coveted awards that we seek. Frederick, no. But more interestingly, 9 years later, he went on to win, I believe, the first World Press Photo of the Year award from this part of the world.
I don't know.
Yeah. I think so. We can check out on records. But anyway, the big one. Yeah. That was not much later than that. And who we have here is also interesting in the sense that we have Munem Wasif on the other side, a young photographer from Pathshala who graduated from Pathshala, now is a teacher at Pathshala. And they have quite different trajectories in the sense that Pablo is self-taught, made his own way, was very much a person of the street, doing what he did best. But having grown through that, he now has taken on a very different role within photography within India. And I thought it would be interesting for Wasif and Pablo to talk about, do a little comparison between their lives, how it changed or where the similarities were. I'll give you a little secret. Wasif was talking about how, at Angkor, was it?
Yeah.
The two of them were chatting, and he was saying that, well, after a few beers, he was being quite candid, and he said a lot of things. I wonder if he'll say that in public. So let's see.
This is a nice honey trap. Okay.
It's interesting, but it will be interesting to know Pablo because, in our generation, the people who really wanted to produce personal work, they always complain. They say there is not enough work in the market, the time has shifted. It was the time of 60s, 70s and 80s where magazines were commissioning photographers for a lot of money. And I think you have a really interesting time at that period, in a sense that on one hand you got early recognition, but on the other hand I'm sure like you have problem in the school and you have done different things. So how you look back at your that part of life, it was hard for you? If you like, what is it about?
Well, beginnings are always hard when you leave school. When you leave school and with the stigma, it's a bit difficult. And I was lucky that I had the parents that I had because they were quite liberal and were both educators. So in a certain way, it must have been harder for them to find that their child has been asked to leave school. But I remember my father telling me this very straight. He said, look, we don't have the connections to get you into another good school. The reason why I went to this school, which was very elitist and coveted in Delhi, is because my father taught there. So because he taught there in the 50s, I had, which I blew. So he said to me, he said, look, the most important thing in life is to be happy. I don't care if you want to be a bricklayer, but figure it out for yourself what you want to do and see that you're going to be happy in that. So that was the kind of big leveler. I mean, here was a father telling his kid, I don't want you to be, a lot of kids have this pressure, become a doctor, become an engineer, become this, that, whatever, accountant. Basically, parents in, I think, South Asia want their children to be successful, which is not a bad ambition. But here were these two parents of mine, both refugees. One came from Pakistan, the other from Burma. Made their life sort of socialist in their outlook, intellectual, never made enough money, but achieved a lot in what they did in the arts and had a lot of goodwill. Were telling their son, just be happy, that's it.
So then you go to the morphine addicts to take for rough because you were happy?
No, I had my own ways of happiness which existed. That's one of the reasons the school didn't want me around, lest I infect,
Other kids.
yes, something like that. But, I think in a generation that you're in right now, there's a lot, while people may complain about, the magazine world has collapsed, which it has. But I think you have much more access to all sorts of grants. There are festivals that you can go to. There are alternative avenues which are available, and I think in your generation, if people use it well, those accesses are available. Plus, the world is so much more connected, which means that if you do something interesting here, you can be picked up in other places. In my time, it was a much more closed world. Plus, I think the reading of photography was much more primitive, which meant that what I was doing with my photographs, with the documentary work, with the friends, the family, the marginal people, the outcasts, wasn't really of interest to the West. What was interest was the political upheaval, caste issues, poverty. Those were the things that was much more interesting for the media. The media always looked at South Asia as, this place where horrors happened. And then later on, when the economic change started to come about, as the success and the business and the IT stories. But being part of the media or having chose to put myself in that space, I've been to Bangladesh several times. I had a little nickname here called the Cyclone King because there was a time when I could just come in and move quite easily, and because of the slight amount of Bengali I can speak, it was easy enough to get around. But coming back to the work of my sort of mid-teens to 25, I put it away pretty much because it didn't have a way of seeing, a dialogue. Also, I got just so busy with the media from 1983 onwards. And then in 1984, when after the Bhopal gas tragedy, which was in December, the photo agency that I worked with, Gamma Liaison, entered the photos. And then I got this, telegram. In those days, it was still telegram and telexes, saying that I had won the picture of the year, which was, exhilarating. And that sort of just kept moving on. There was so much in the continent in South Asia happening that I just worked in the media till about the late 90s, when again things started to change, where you had the mergers and acquisitions. You had Getty and Corbis, the two big super agencies, buying other agencies up. And it didn't seem so much attractive. Everything started to change. The way people started to use pictures, the amount of pictures, the number of days of work, all of that started to change. Plus, I think the most frightening was when the models started to change. Is in the photo agency model that I worked in, you had the copyright of your work. And when you, the new model with the digital world was, we give you a salary and a clever way of putting is a joint copyright, but for all practical purposes, you're giving away the commercial rights to the photo agency. And it just didn't seem an interesting way to work. Plus, I was wanting to find a new avenue. There was a period of 5 years where I went into the internet and started software developing. I think that may have been a bad phase for me, but it was still something that I needed to do because I needed to find tools to, have an archive up, to be able to, distribute work. And out of that, some interesting projects came about, like for the World Press Photo, my company handled for 7 years all the online, the offline workshops. So from the physical workshop to, the relationships between the tutors and the students over the year or year and a half was all facilitated on our platform. So it was still working with photography and around photography, and but it sort of, if I needed to do this more and more, it meant I needed to grow as a company, and it would have taken me away from photography, and I wanted to stay very much photographing and also finding a new way or going back to my old language that I spoke, which I put away. So I started to look at that archive.
Yeah, just before going there, so you never felt tired working for this magazine or newspapers and going to this location and producing these stories? And when I look back to your old work, there is a certain difference in terms of the speed, in terms of the intimacy, in terms of a lot of things. So how you differentiate these two body of work or these two different set of time which you have photographed?
Well, recently I've been thinking more about it, and because I've been doing so many exhibitions from the archive, there's been a Q&A in the last exhibition that I did, the catalog, and I sort of term it as slow photography and fast photography. So very much like slow cooking and fast food. Sometimes when you work in the media, especially the news end, you have to work very fast. It can, you end up also producing sometimes stereotypes in imagery, because that's what is needed. There is, of course, great opportunities that you can get and have and produce wonderful work too. But what I'm now thinking is, after now nearly finished with my archive of my teenage to mid-20s, is I want to look at my archive of the news work that I did, because I got everything back from the photo agency, and actually look at the outs, because when people edit in the West, they're editing for a specific story or a nuance, and I'd like to look at everything and see, and actually see, did I do something which I can work differently, or did I produce a lot of stuff which was just catering to a certain need? And that's the next step that I will take. But coming back to the first phase, my mid-teens to my mid-20s, it was also very hard because there was this whole anxiety of having to earn money and also wanting to be successfully recognized. There was a point I did a lot of advertising work in Bombay, and I made a lot of money, probably the most that I would ever have. But I walked away from it because it was just too easy a life and too dull to work with very mediocre art directors in the advertising that wanted to just copy paste and then present to clients, and then you had to replicate that. It was very dull. I mean, there was a lot of money, but then money wasn't the objective. And the editorial world seemed, the sort of way to go.
Pablo, there is a little area which I'm not too sure about, because a 19-year-old, that's pretty young, yeah? 74, that's a time when we really don't know so much about the photographic world and not so well connected, whatever. I don't know about you. Here in Bangladesh, we had World Press for the first time in 1993. And at that time, I think there weren't any entries from Bangladesh going into World Press. So how were you, as a young 19-year-old, clued in enough to produce this work? This was analog days, so you had to make prints, you had to post them, send them off, and they would burn them afterwards, remember? So how were you tapped into that network as a 19-year-old?
I entered these pictures in a local award called the Press Institute of India. At that time on the jury was, I think she's Hungarian, Eva Coletti. I don't know if you know the name. She was on it, and when I won the award there, she said to me, "You have to send it to the World Press photo. This is something which is very good." And so through her intervention, not direct, but she left me the address and things like that. I forget where I got the form from now, but I filled it up, and I made fairly handsome large prints. I rolled it up into a roll, put it in with the form, and mailed it out. And I went back home and I told my dad, "Oh, I sent these pictures." And he was just freaked out. He said, "What? You mailed these pictures? What happens if the customs open it? You can get into big trouble." Because this was pictures of people shooting up and things like that. So,
that means your father doesn't know a lot of the other things you were doing at that time.
Do most parents know what their kids do? I believe you, when you have your child, we'll see how much you know.
So then you have to come back again.
Yeah, of course I will.
Yeah, but on the other hand, Alamba, it will be interesting. You know Raghu, you know Daineta, you know Prashant, there are a lot of big names in India. And of course, Pablo is one of them. I think maybe he will be the most difficult one to work with. How was your experience when you first met him? He was like this?
Well, we used to meet up, what was it, ICCI or something like that?
IIC.
IIC. We used to often meet up at the IIC. There would be all these people you're talking about, Daineta, Pablo, Raghu, Prashant, Satish Sharma initially until he got blacklisted. And then we'd chat and whatever, and they'd go, when I left, they'd go, karne hoga yaar. And then we'd come back another 2 years later, and again we'd go, karne hoga yaar. But that's where it stayed. But you did other things. I mean, in a way, it's not a direct answer to your question. They are all very dear friends. I respect them for what they are. I think what hasn't happened in India is the collective work that has happened. And they are very individual in some senses. But having said that, You have a reputation, Pablo, in two areas. You've been mentoring many people, but you've also been very stern. You've been harsh on them. Uh, and I think there is a reverence for you in terms of you being a straight talker and giving them things as they are. But they're also a little bit scared of you. Some of them. Yeah. And all of these different personalities have interacted differently. I'm very curious because we've talked, I move on to it because one of the questions I was going to ask is, you as a self-taught individual, you know, here I am as someone who's invested a lot of my time and energy on education. I myself am self-taught, you're self-taught. Here's a person who's gone through an educational system and done remarkably well. What do we do in terms of those spaces? We've talked about it occasionally. You've talked about setting up this school at your place. Raghu recently has set up a school that his son runs. Dainita's introduced this award that she goes. So we've tried to grapple with it in different ways. Where do you see it going in India?
Well, I don't think there's a whole rash of now photography institutions that have come up. There are two in Pune, run through universities. In Bombay, there's one or two. Some of them are racked towards the commercial end because Bombay has commercial. In Delhi now there are, I think, 3 that I know of. But I'm not sure where all of this is going, and I frankly fear, being self-taught, at the pace or the volumes of people that, and I use the term manufactured. Where do they go? What happens? What jobs do they get? And most of them come out with a fairly ideal kind of thought process of photography and this and that. And it's all, they have their icons and role models and all that. But the whole thing is that it's a very practical business too. And that's why when I went to Pathshala a few days ago, and they had the projector ready, and I also pulled my computer out, and I thought to myself, no, I don't think I'm going to show pictures. I'm going to talk to them and find out what they're doing, what their thought processes are, and where they're going. And I started out with asking, do you understand the business of photography? And then we got on to other things like publishing. We didn't get into the exhibition area. But with all of this, there is a whole process of being able to understand what it is, position yourself, have some amount of financial ideas as to what you're going to do, how you're going to do, how you're going to get clients. And I think that's one big area, whether in India or even in Pathshala, is I don't think students are prepared for life in terms of how to then navigate once you're out. You may have the skills, whether it's in multimedia or in photography, to start communicating. But this skill that you have, how do you start to earn money? That is a negotiation that starts after. And there are people, who may be very sensitive, who may be very creative, but they just don't have that faculty of, negotiating with the client. How do you talk about money? And it took me for years because, my parents were terrible at it and I had to struggle. Of course, having an agent did help, but always, the thing is, because I worked with the American part of my photo agency, I had a kind of unstated deal where I could work directly in Europe. So there were many magazines that I worked with in Europe and then put the work back for secondary distribution. So there was you had to negotiate, and I think that's something very important Because when I ask the kids, do you know what the day rates in here, there, whatever parts of the world are? And I think even in Pathshala by year 3, they should know.
Yeah, in fact, it's very pertinent. In fact, what we do in year 3 is talk about survival techniques, which includes, negotiating, as you suggest, quite rightly, looking at contracts, looking at copyright issues, but also presentation skills. How do you present yourself? How do you convince someone at the end of the day that your work is what it is? A client, of course, looks at the work, but at the end of the day, they're commissioning a human being. And they need to sense that passion, that energy, to be convinced that this is what it is. I'd like to move on to something we briefly talked about yesterday. Your show is at the Drake Gallery upstairs. You arrived early to set it up in a particular way. You wanted to have a particular look. You were insisting that that was the space where you'd have it, where the two bodies of work would be together and things like that, and complementary. But I'm very keen on finding out how you went about this process of discovery, because you talked about going through your old work, and one of the things that fascinates me is going through my old contact sheets. Of course, now you don't have contact sheets anymore, so perhaps you don't do that, but just revisiting your contact sheets, for me, has been remarkable. It's given me an insight into myself I didn't know. But in terms of going through your archives, what have you found out about yourself, or your dad for that matter, that were discoveries?
I think when I started to go through my archive, it was kind of shock and awe. It was sort of trying to come to terms that at a young age, one had a naive eye, but it was a developed eye, and there was thought, feeling, understanding of light, all that a photographer endears to, get as a skill set, but it was nicely used. And then one abandoned all of this. Then when one started a year later, I started in 2005, and I remember in 2006, when we had an evening session, I randomly on the computer started to go through folders and show people what I was doing, because after I'd made my formal presentation, people said, "What are you doing now? What are you doing now?" So I said, "I'm working with the archive." Then a year after, I went into my father's archive, and the way I've worked with both of them is I've scanned sort of medium res, everything, folder-wise. So each folder is the negative wallet, 36 or whatever number there are. And if there were, of course, my father's has medium format too. And then just work with it on the screen, because I just find that I'm much faster and I can look at things easier on the screen. I know the classic contact sheet, but we didn't make them then enough, would be a wonderful way of being able to look at another read as to how you navigated and sequentially photographed. But not having that, I just sort of work digitally and have been able to sort of edit things to make bodies of work. And now that my show is, I think, the 12th viewing in different, I've done it in 12 different venues. So in each place I try and make it a little different, or sometimes the space dictates it. There are some common things, like, for example, for my father's, I always want a very clean, narrow, simple frame, and sort of presented in an old formal style. For me, I like to play around, and that's why, even looking at different printing surfaces, and I printed on vinyl, and though I brought self-adhesive vinyl, which you could stick up, I chickened out and have nailed them. But, you know, it's also, after being part of the gallery scene and selling photographs, I also want to move away, like in Encore, did the outdoor show again on vinyl, you know, hung up. Here, just nailed, so that there is, you know, going outside, going out of the frame, no frame, so, you know, not making it into such a precious object. Sometimes photography, you know, put into all these frames and on a wall lit nicely, can become too precious. So to sort of, you know, try and get away from that. But it's been a journey. I mean, you know, one started off very classic. Now I'm here, I don't know where I'll go. So, you know.
Yeah. But one thing was very interesting, you know, in both ways, I think, I remember Pablo always because of his attitudes. I remember I met him in Pepinia on the rooftop of where all these agencies are. And I don't know very well this guy, and he told me, what the hell are you doing here? So I said, no, what's wrong? I'm just chilling out. He said, you should go to the office, look at all the editors who are in the town and call them and show your work. I said, holy shit, that's so difficult, you know, to go door to door and show your work. In one sense, I think it's your strength. I remember talking with all the people in your office who were getting your emails and trying to coordinate the show. I'm sure they're all pissed off, and they were all telling me, who is this Pablo? We want to see him. But at the end, when I look at the show, I feel really happy because it looks really great. But on the other hand, do you think because your father and mother, they were both artists and they have a really struggling life, and in terms of money, and in terms of also how they are placed in India, they have moved from different places, that made you really tough to face these realities and be really straight?
I guess in some ways, well, the door-to-door part, let's start when I don't recall the conversation, but I'll take it at face value. Yeah, when I made enough money and I went abroad to find an agent, it was like, you know, had your little portfolio, and it was like a door-to-door thing. So you went through all the various photo agencies in Paris, then you went to London, there were fewer, and then you went to New York. And then finally in New York I had a handshake, but it was like, you know, going around. And then of course doing the rounds of the magazines and things like that. So, you know.
The reason I was saying, because you guys were talking about the business of photography, I remember when I first went to Europe and you introduced me to a few of the people, and I showed my work to Stan, Paddy Match and all the people, and they all told me to work in color and base somewhere else, either in Pakistan or in Kathmandu, because the news was there. And I feel very lucky I didn't listen to them, and I keep producing what I want. Still there are a lot I need to produce, but I think regarding the business part, people can get also, it can be very manipulating. It can mislead a lot of young photographers to somewhere, maybe where they don't want to be.
No, I mean, when I say business, I mean business practice, in the sense that what is the way that you work with photography in the West? It's to do with rates and rights. You are licensing your rights. It's pretty much the same way like TV networks license footage or whatever. People just need to be aware of what the minimum standards are.
For sure.
Though it's a knowledge base that you have, I don't think it changes you drastically in any manner. It just helps you not being exploited, because you can be exploited, because you're from a faraway country, somebody wants to, you know, not pay you your due, or if you have something important which nobody else has, you should be in a position to be able to command much more. And those are things that if you know, you can. If you don't, then you just accept what is given.
I can give you a little example of that. This is very interesting. Chandan, one of the Drick calendars, yeah, Chandan, his picture was being used in Durban, in Switzerland. And without credits, without any reference, this was just published and whatever. So I wrote after this guy to say, by the way, this happens to be our picture, whatever. And he wrote this amazing letter. He says, "Oh, I'm so happy you wrote to me. Someone gave me a copy of the Drick calendar. The cover picture cover pages were not there, so I didn't know who it was. I published it anyway. I was looking for these people. And they've been publishing the entire series, yeah? I'm so happy that you finally contacted me because I was really feeling guilty about it, and here's $100, yeah? So then I wrote back to say, by the way, these are what you've been publishing, and what you do is illegal and everything else, and unless these are our rates, and if you do not pay by such and such a date, you get a legal notice. We got a check back for $1,400 by return of post. People take you for a ride. So it's a question of not being taken for a ride. I agree with both sides. I think it is important, and he in a way suggested it, because he said he was able to give up the commercial work, which often isn't so easy to do because it's sexy, there's money in it and everything else. He wanted to do what he does. On the other hand, it's a question of being pragmatic. It's a question of being efficient. It's a question of getting out there. Things happen the other way around as well. I mean, I know in my case, again, similar trajectories, being self-taught. There was a time when I was doing very boring work, taking pictures of kids. This is in London, I'd put a sheepskin rug, I'd put a blue background, I'd take happy, smiling pictures of kids. And pretty much any parent who sees a reasonably in-focus picture, smiling picture of their kid, thinks it's the most beautiful picture in the world, and they will buy it. So this works. I was making, in 1983, about £350 a week. I'd never made that money in my life. And I was very concerned because I thought, hey, this is not really photography. But they said, what are you talking about? You're our star photographer. You make more money than anyone else. And I thought at that time, if I continued, I'd start believing this was good photography. And that, I think, is the difficult one, where you really need to understand for yourself that while money is important, of course it is important for all of us, at the end of the day, that doesn't determine whether your work is of a quality or not. And recognizing that, making that transition is a very difficult one. And we've all made it in different ways, some have not. And I think it is important to get that idea across.
But let me answer your question.
Again.
No, I don't think I answered it. I went off. You asked me about whether, because of my parents, the way they were, I am what I am. Well, I think a lot has to do with the way I grew up, not necessarily with the way my parents brought me up, but I was on the street. So in that sense, I'm a street fighter, because you start from zero and you have to work your way up. In that department, I don't think I had any help from my parents. Where I had a great amount of help was I was kind of self-educated at home. At the end of the day, what does a university do? It exposes you to a huge amount of things, challenges you, makes you think. That's what happened at home. All the books were there. I was taken to see all the great films. I knew about Western music, Indian classical music, the arts, the visual arts, both in the Oriental end, in the Western end. So there was a kind of rounded grounding that I had, but I didn't have grounding in business and money, which I had to flounder but basically just finding work. And finding work can make you a bit tough. And I think my father's death when I was about 27 had a huge impact. And I know I became harder somewhere. So that could be another you know.
Yeah.
Well, what I'd like to do, because we're running short of time, is open it up to the audience. Do you have questions? Do you have this gentleman in front of you? This is a chance when he's on Hard Talk. You can ask him questions. We too can badger him. Please, let's open it up and fire away at him.
I'm sorry that the work, I mean, it would have been nice to have had some work just to contextualize what we all are talking about, but it is at Brick House. I hope the show will be open
Yes,
tomorrow.
yeah, it'll be
I'll
open.
be gone because I'm gone tomorrow, so I won't be able to have any conversations, unfortunately, beyond this evening, but if there are questions, I'm happy to take them.
If you could introduce yourself as well. Or can I come like that a bit? You can take mine. Shona যাচ্ছে. Shona.
Last night you were telling about the recent discoveries of the Indian archives from the old government or other institutions. Are you personally working on that project, or you just know that this is being going on by somebody else?
No, I mean, I am, let's say, very closely in touch, not necessarily involved. Sabina Gadioke is a filmmaker and a historian, and she has been working with Homai Veriawala. In fact, she became like the adopted daughter of Homai. And over the years, I've seen what Sabina's done and how the exhibitions have gone about. And then they've taken the archive very recently and put it with the Al-Qazi Foundation just before Homai died. Because that's the big problem is if you have an archive and it's an important historical archive, how is it and where is it going to go? Again, I grew up with the photographer Aditya Arya, who is principally a commercial photographer, but his sort of adopted uncle is Kulwant Roy, and for years Addy used to tell me, you know, I've got this guy's negatives in my trunk and whatever, and we've got to do something with it. So here's another guy who's pulled it out. Sunil Jana, again, I interacted with for a short period when there was, with another filmmaker friend, this whole thing of maybe doing a film on Sunil Jana, so we went to meet him and things like that. But more importantly, my school friend Ram Rahman has worked with Sunil Jana, his archive, for many years, done a spectacular show of his work in New York, where there were over 300 pictures, where all of Jana's early work, the Bengal famine, his industrial work, all put together, the freedom movement, the communist movement, you know, all of that. So in that sense, I am very much embedded. Part of it is when I was growing up, there was a period where I was, you know, there was no work happening and it was dark ages kind of feeling. And I started to think of an alternative option, and I met this American professor who was an historian, and we collaborated on some photo projects, and I started to get interested in the history of photography. So I did go into studios like Bourne and Shepherd, which was still there. Bourne and Shepherd then subsequently burned down, and was able to look through their material quite extensively. I also have a small collection of glass plates of my own. So in that sense, you know, and I do a talk on my history of Indian photography, which is very personal, and all these people come in. So I call Sunil Jana the communist, I call Homai Veriawala the royalist, and I call Kulwant Roy the nationalist, because he was in the British Air Force and got thrown out, things like that, and went very anti-English. So there is a connection.
Other questions? There's one.
I think I would consider myself a photographer. Whether you you put it in the realm of documentary, photojournalism, reportage, fine art, it's sort of, the boundaries blur. They've always been blurry for me. But I guess the external world needs to tag you and put you into a little box, and I've been in these boxes or changed boxes around, but basically I'm a photographer. I don't even like necessarily the term artist, though now that I am embedded in the gallery world, the gallerists are very keen to, term you as an artist rather than photographer, because for their clients or collectors, the artist is the thing and the photographer sort of has some other connotation. But personally, I prefer just photographer. I don't know about these two gentlemen.
Well, I mean, I'll take it on. I think one of the things that does come up every now and then is photography art, and I find it a very banal question and a pretty meaningless question as such. A painter would never have to defend whether painting is art, and I don't think art should be pegged to the mode of production. I think that's a very limited definition of art in the first place, and we seem to have bought into that definition that's been touted. So I think it is time we went beyond that. But there is something more. Just in case people don't know, Ron was the first year student, first batch student of Pathshala. Frederick Beemans over there is from World Press Photo. Yeah. Do you want to add to that?
No, I think it will be too early for me to comment on that. But I think, sometimes, for me, I think it's interesting when you have transition. For me, I was taking an interview of Pablo and I was telling him, I was reading a discussion about Devika and one other curator in the book called India Now, where they were saying at a certain point they were looking at Indian photography and they were on the Raghu, Prashant, Pablo, who were more documentary and photojournalists, and they were photographing the roads, the unknown and the other. And then Dainita came in and few other photographers, and then they see the urban middle class inner India. And then I saw Pablos' work, which he have done long before, and he have produced the interior India maybe like far before than any of them. I think, I think these boundaries, I think it can make you really, what you say, boxed, but I think it will be more interesting to be open and challenge yourself rather than producing the work that people have recognized, and they want you to produce the same kind of work. So, anyway.
Well, on that, sorry, did you want to have a last word?
No.
Sure?
Good.
You're done. Okay. Well, on that note, thank you very much. Have a safe trip to India. Yeah? And congratulations on your Padma Shri.
Thank you.